They were unearthed not by police, not by archaeologists, but by chance. A rusted pipe burst beneath an unmarked tract of land on the outskirts of Brookhaven, New Hampshire. It was just a quiet field. No markers, no fences, just trees on the edge of nowhere. But when the ground gave way, the truth clawed its way out. The first responders expected animal remains, maybe an old hunting dump site. What they found was a mass of human bones, hundreds of them, stacked in concentric spirals, layered like a ritual offering, limbs tangled, skulls resting on rib cages, no coffins, no clothes, no ID, just decay, and something stranger carved into the femurs, etched into shoulder blades, burned into the bone, a symbol dot, something that didn't belong to any known religion or culture, something older. By the time the local police called in the FBI, the news had broken. Asterisk mass grave unearthed in Brookhaven woods. Authorities stunned. The footage was blurred, censored, but the whispers had already begun. A cult, a secret society, something buried, not just physically, but historically, something the town had tried to forget. Most people in Brookhaven had never heard of. The Eldritch Fellowship, a few had they remembered, stories told in hushed tones, strange lights, missing persons, families that left in the dead of night and were never seen again. But those were legends, campfire tales. No one believed them. Until now. Because legends don't leave behind. 112 bodies, and symbols don't carve themselves into bone. The Eldritch Fellowship was never supposed to be real until now. Brookhaven County sits quietly in the shadow of the Cascade Mountains, wrapped in a veil of mist and memory. It's the kind of place that doesn't appear on tourist maps. A fog-bound town tucked between rain-soaked evergreens and winding logging roads, where time seems to move slower and the silence holds weight. The forests here are thick, ancient, always damp. Locals say the moss grows faster than the trees, and the rain never really stops. The town itself is a patchwork of rusted pickup trucks, weathered storefronts, and wooden signs that haven't been repainted since the Reagan years. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your name and your family's sins. In 2022, a new hiking trail was proposed by the county in hopes of bringing in tourism and revitalizing the area's economy. It was supposed to be a simple, project a scenic path through the old Brookhaven woods just outside the town's northern boundary. But when the construction crews began clearing the land, they hit something unexpected. At first, it looked like a tangle of roots. Then the smell hit them, something older, more terrible. They had broken open a burial site, but not just any site. Authorities would later confirm what they initially refused to believe. 112 human bodies, many dismembered, arranged deliberately beneath the forest floor. No markers, no records, no rational explanation. Forensic analysis would reveal something. Even more disturbing, the remains spanned decades. Some dated back to the early 1960s. Others appeared as recent as the mid-1990s. All shared one thing in common: signs of ritualistic placement and the same strange symbol carved into their bones. Brookhaven had always kept its secrets in the soil. People whispered about strange disappearances, cult rumors, and off-the-grid communes hidden deep in the forest. But no one ever expected those whispers to take form. No one expected to dig into the past and find it staring back, silent and decayed. What lay beneath the moss wasn't just evidence. It was a revelation, and Brookhaven would never be the same. When the news first broke, it was Sheriff Eliza Grant who stood at the edge of the excavation site, her badge glinting in the early morning sun and her expression unreadable. She had been the first official on the scene when the construction crew called it in, and for a moment it seemed she would be the voice guiding the town through its darkest hour. In the first 48 hours, she gave short, terse interviews to local news outlets, describing the discovery as a historical site of undetermined origin. But then she stopped talking. No press conferences, no public updates. Requests for comment were redirected to the FBI. Those close to her say she changed, grew distant, colder. Rumors suggest she had seen something she wasn't supposed to, something that made her question everything she thought she knew about Brookhaven. Enter Dr. Malcolm Ashcroft, a veteran forensic anthropologist from Portland, called in to lead the identification process. Methodical and meticulous, Ashcroft was no stranger to mass graves. He'd spent years working in international conflict zones. But Brookhaven, he admitted, was different. The remains showed signs of deliberate arrangement, not just murder, but ritual. The carvings etched into bone were precise, repetitive, and consistent across decades. This wasn't random, he said in a now-archived interview. It was orchestrated, almost like performance. Ashcroft became obsessed with deciphering the symbol, believing it to be a key, perhaps even a language. But after a few months, he too went quiet. His final report was heavily redacted. Then he resigned. Colleagues say he burned every one of his field journals before he left town. Then came the break no one expected, Judith Ward. In 1993, she vanished without a trace, presumed to have joined a New Age commune or fallen off the grid. But in 2022, she resurfaced, frail, aged, and ready to talk. She claimed to have been a member of the Eldritch Fellowship for over a decade. Her voice shaking, she recounted strange gatherings in the woods, coded chants, and a doctrine centered on something they called the severance. But it wasn't just faith, she said. It was submission, absolute control. She described punishments for disobedience, the disappearances, and finally, her escape. Her handwritten statement, leaked to an independent journalist, named several high-ranking members, but the names were all redacted in the official record. Ward disappeared again shortly after her testimony. Some say she was placed in protective custody. Others believe she was silenced. But perhaps the most haunting thread came from a source long forgotten, Patient 62. No one knows his real name. He was institutionalized in 1978 after being found wandering near Brookhaven, naked and covered in blood, speaking in fragmented sentences. He was labeled schizophrenic, unreliable, delusional. For over 4 decades, he spoke of the fellowship, of a group that lived in the forest, that carved symbols into bones, that believed death was not the end but a transformation. His drawings, dismissed as the product of psychosis, matched the symbols found in the excavation, word for word, line for line. When asked how he knew, he only smiled and whispered, "Because I died once, and they brought me back." Each name carries a shadow, but some chose silence, and others weren't allowed to speak. The question that haunts Brookhaven now isn't just who buried the bodies, but how many people helped cover it up. The town of Brookhaven has always had stories. Old tales passed down by grandparents around fire pits, stories of flickering lights in the woods, and whispers that didn't match the wind. For years, they were dismissed as folklore, the harmless traditions of an isolated town nestled in the shadows of the Cascade Mountains. But as the years stretched on, those stories began to take shape, and what once felt like myth began to rot into something darker. The first true fracture in the town's collective. Denial came in the summer of 1968. It was the night of the solstice, when a group of local teenagers, 6 of them, all friends from the high school track team, gathered near the edge of Hollow Pines Grove for an annual bonfire. It was tradition. Every year, the older kids would light a fire, drink smuggled beer, and talk about what they'd do once they left Brookhaven behind. That night, the fire was found still smoldering the next morning. Their cars were parked in a neat row, but the kids were gone. No signs of a struggle, no footprints leading out, just smoke and silence. Search dogs couldn't pick up a trail. The forest, for once, refused to speak. The case was marked unsolved. The parents clung to hope for months, some for years. But in time, the town closed its eyes and moved on by the winter of 1974. Something strange had settled over Hollow Pines Grove. Campers began reporting rhythmic sounds at night, drums, chanting, and distant flickers of torchlight beyond the tree line. A pair of hikers claimed to have stumbled upon a circle of figures in hooded robes, but by the time authorities were called, there was no trace. The sheriff's office received over 24 calls between October and December, all describing the same thing. Midnight gatherings, lights in the trees, the sound of people singing, in a language we didn't understand. Some of the more religious locals believed it was satanic. Others thought it was just pranksters. No arrests were ever made. The police logs remain thin, marked unresolved and unsubstantiated. But one deputy's handwritten note, later recovered from a retired officer's garage, told a different story. In red pen, underlined twice, * they were in the trees, watching us. They never stopped watching. Then came the spring of 1982. A local farmer named Clyde Abernathy was out checking his property lines when he discovered something gruesome near the tree line behind his barn. A deer fully grown, but butchered with a precision that suggested more than just a predator. Its limbs had been arranged, not scattered. The organs were removed cleanly and placed in a nearby bowl fashioned from woven twigs and animal hide. Around the body, a perfect circle of stones. Each stone bore the same symbol, the crescent eye, the one later found carved into human bone in 2022. Abernathy reported it to the police, who came out and took photographs. But within days, the report vanished from the county records. Clyde would later tell his niece, years later, on his deathbed, that men in suits had come to the farm, not locals, not state, and they had warned him to forget what he saw. He moved out of Brookhaven that same year and never returned. Between these moments, 1968, 1974, 1982, a pattern had begun to emerge, but Brookhaven wasn't ready to see it. Too many people had too much to lose. The town's economy depended on its peaceful image, quaint, secluded, safe. So the stories stayed buried, just whispers at the diner, glances exchanged at town hall meetings. Children were taught to avoid Hollow Pines. Parents warned their kids not to stay out after dark. But no one ever asked why, not out loud, and yet the forest never stopped speaking. By the mid-1980s, more strange sightings filtered in. Hikers who lost time, campers who returned pale and disoriented, unable to remember where they'd gone, dogs that refused to enter certain parts of the woods. A local mailman who claimed he saw people standing perfectly still in the fog near the trailhead. People who vanished the moment he blinked. One of the most unsettling reports came from a retired teacher who swore that one morning, while walking past the town library, she saw a group of figures inside before the building had even opened. Hooded, unmoving, watching her from the windows. Still, there were no arrests, no investigations that lasted more than a week. Just a growing silence, like the town had made an unspoken agreement with the woods. Asterisk, we won't ask, and you won't come any closer. Asterisk, but secrets, like roots, grow beneath the surface, twisting, spreading, until something breaks. By the late 1970s, the unease in Brookhaven had begun to fester. What had once been the stuff of folklore was now becoming an unspoken reality. Church attendance soared. Doors were locked earlier. Children were kept off the streets after dark. And the once innocent phrase, "Don't go near the woods," became an iron rule in every household. Brookhaven didn't speak openly, but behind closed doors, it began to pray harder. The first wave of public alarm came in 1976, when Reverend Wallace Green of the First Light Baptist Church delivered a fiery sermon titled Asterisk, There Are Wolves Among Us. He stood at the pulpit, voice shaking, his eyes fixed on the congregation as if daring someone to deny what he knew. Without naming names, he accused certain elements in town of consorting with forces that mocked God and bathed in darkness. He called it devil worship, not metaphorically, but literally. His words were recorded and passed around quietly on cassette tapes, fueling an invisible fire. Within days, handmade flyers appeared around town, crude sketches of crescent moons, black eyes, and cryptic phrases like asterisk, "They are already here." Reverend Green received anonymous threats, dead birds nailed to his door. And then, 3 months later, he vanished. His car was found abandoned on the outskirts of Hollow Pines Grove. The engine was cold. The doors were unlocked. He was never seen again in the wake of his disappearance. Whispers intensified around a name that had lingered in local lore for decades. The Children of the Moon Root. At first, it sounded like just another ghost story, but the stories were always the same. A hidden group deep in the forest, robed and faceless, performing strange rites beneath the new moon. They were said to live without electricity, without identification, off the grid in every possible way. Locals spoke of people who would go hiking and come back, different, or not come back at all. One woman claimed her brother went into the woods for a weekend, camping trip, and returned with a scar behind his ear and a complete loss of short-term memory. He wouldn't speak about what happened, only that the forest showed him something. Between 1975 and 1985, Brookhaven saw a terrifying spike in disappearances. Missing persons posters tripled, hikers, drifters, and even locals began vanishing without trace. Some families left town entirely, unwilling to risk staying another night. The county sheriff's office quietly began compiling data, but their internal memos, later leaked to a regional newspaper, showed a troubling pattern. The disappearances clustered along specific trails, mostly near Hollow Pines and the ridge near Moonroot Hollow. Despite this, no public warning was ever issued. The official line remained the same. There is no evidence of foul play. Still, the atmosphere shifted. Grocery clerks stopped making eye contact. Conversations hushed when strangers entered the room. Candlelight vigils were held in a churchyard every new moon. and the town's children began reciting a new bedtime prayer, not from scripture, but something else entirely, something old. Asterisk, light above, root below, keep me far from what they know. No one could recall where it came from, but everyone seemed to know it. Then came the outsiders, backpackers, spiritual seekers, amateur occultists. Brookhaven had been a dot on the map until now, a place forgotten by time. But as tales of the Moonroot children circulated through fringe newsletters and early conspiracy zines, people began arriving, hoping to see something, sacred or strange. Some claimed they did. Visitors reported hearing chants in the middle of the night, not echoing from a building, but drifting from the tree canopy itself. A married couple from Seattle described stumbling upon a moss-covered altar surrounded by bones while on a weekend hike. When they tried to return with authorities, the site was gone or moved. By 1981, the local police had grown visibly uncomfortable. Interviews from that time show officers stiff and tight-lipped. One even walked off camera mid-question when asked about ritualistic behavior in the forest. Deputy Ruth McCready, who later left the force, would admit under oath in a deposition that the department had received explicit orders not to pursue any investigations involving symbols, robed individuals, or Moonroot references. She believed it came from the county level, maybe higher. We were told, she said, that it was just panic, that people were scared of shadows, but she didn't believe that, not after finding a mutilated fox nailed to the front door of the station, not after seeing the blackened trees outside her home arranged, she said, into a perfect circle overnight. As the community grew more divided, so did its faith. The churches began to split, some urging patience and prayer, others embracing outright paranoia. A small evangelical group called the Shield of Michael began patrolling the woods with rifles and spotlights. They claimed they were watching the Watchers. But after one of their members went missing during a solo patrol, the group disbanded. His body was never found, just a boot and a trail of red paint, not blood, that led into the trees and ended in nothing. By the mid-1980s, fear had become a quiet contagion. Parents didn't just warn their children about the woods, they taught them how to avoid being followed. Neighbors watched each other. Unexplained lights in the sky were reported, then retracted. A small bookstore that sold occult literature was burned down in 1983. The fire marshal claimed it was electrical. Locals whispered otherwise. Still, no one could prove anything. The fellowship, if it existed, remained invisible, a presence, only felt an absence, a silence that grew louder each year. Those who believed were called paranoid. Those who questioned too loudly were warned, or worse, disappeared. And all the while, the forest stood still, watching, waiting. Brookhaven, by 1985, was no longer just a quiet mountain town. It had become something else, a wound, the kind that doesn't bleed, but festers. And under the roots, something continued to grow. In the summer of 1991, the illusion shattered. It was a bright June afternoon when Thomas Bell, an experienced hiker from Bend, Oregon, set off alone along a little-used trail that wound through the outer ridges of Hollow Pines Grove. He had been hiking these forests for years, drawn by their beauty and solitude, but this time something was different. A strange quiet hung in the air, no birdsong, no wind, just the hum of heat and the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. Bell would later tell reporters that he felt watched long before he made the discovery, near the edge of a shallow ravine, half buried beneath layers of pine needles and moss. he spotted what looked like a bundle of dark cloth. Curious, and assuming it might be trash or a lost item, he knelt down and brushed the debris away. That's when he saw it. A human arm, dismembered cleanly at the shoulder, wrapped tightly in weather-worn black linen. Embroidered on the cloth, in faded crimson thread, was a strange curling symbol. An eye twisted into the shape of a thorn, surrounded by crescent arcs. Bell froze, then vomited, then ran. His report reached the local authorities within hours. By morning, the site was cordoned off, and the remains were transported to a lab in Eugene for examination. But what happened next took the story from local curiosity to national attention. The symbol, embroidered into the cloth, had a match. One that had been logged in a closed, unofficial file connected to unsolved disappearances across 3 states. Internally, it was referred to as the Mark of the Crooked Thorn. That same week, declassified FBI documents, heavily redacted but unmistakably linked, revealed prior knowledge of a group believed to be operating under a fringe belief system known as the Eldritch Fellowship. A series of internal memos described shared ritual iconography, extreme isolationist tendencies, and possible links to mass disappearances in rural areas. The Brookhaven case was quietly reopened under federal jurisdiction. For a brief, flickering moment, it seemed as though the truth might finally come to light. But then, nothing. Within a month, the FBI investigation was closed without explanation. No follow-up press release, no indictments, no suspects named. The official statement claimed inconclusive forensic evidence and lack of corroborating witness testimony. But Bell was a witness, and so were dozens of others who had come forward in the days following the discovery, including 2 retired rangers who had seen the same symbol carved into trees decades earlier. Bell himself was never contacted again. In a later interview, he said flatly they wanted to bury it. Not investigate, bury it. Local newspapers pushed the story as far as they could, running grainy photos of the site, interviews with frightened locals, and one especially chilling detail: the arm had been severed post-mortem with surgical precision and preserved with an unknown resin. It had not rotted. It looked freshly placed, though forensic analysis confirmed it had been dead for at least 20 years. Someone had kept it. And then, for reasons no one understood, decided it was time to let it be found. For many in Brookhaven, this was the breaking point. Denial was no longer an option. The Fellowship, long dismissed as a fable, had left behind something real, tangible, chilling. And while the FBI walked away, the town couldn't. Candlelight vigils turned into protests. Parents demanded answers from town hall. A petition was circulated to reopen the investigation. But no federal agency responded. Behind closed doors, panic spread. Local officials began resigning. A teacher at Brookhaven High was fired after speaking openly about the Fellowship in class. Conspiracy theorists descended on the town, digging through the woods with metal detectors and video cameras. Some were arrested, others vanished. The forest grew louder. For the first time, the Fellowship had left behind undeniable proof, and, from here on, no one could claim it was just myth. Long before Brookhaven was a town, the land was something else entirely, older, stranger, and steeped in shadows. The region's damp forests and jagged cliffs drew not only homesteaders and fur trappers in the 1800s, but also another kind of pilgrim, those who believed the land itself was sacred, that something ancient still lingered beneath the soil. In the mid-19th century, as occult movements flourished in Europe and along America's east coast, Whispers of energetic lines and thin places began to circulate in esoteric circles. Oregon, with its remote terrain and spiritual mystique, became a destination on what scholars now refer to as the occult migration routes, a hidden network of mystics, fringe preachers, and ceremonial magicians moving west in search of untouched, resonant land. Brookhaven, tucked away beneath the shadow of the Cascade Mountains, was one such place. Settlers wrote of strange stone formations deep in the woods, circles not made by native hands, older than any known tribal markers. Some spoke of monoliths with symbols that resembled pre-Christian sigils, horns, eyes, and roots, all carved with obsessive repetition. Farmers who cleared the land for homesteads reported uncovering ritual pits, filled not with bones, but charred wood, feathers, and figures woven from vine and hair. These discoveries were rarely reported to authorities, but they made their way into journals, passed down through generations, always ending with a warning. Asterisk, do not dig deep. The ground remembers. Asterisk, by the 1880s, fringe religious groups began quietly settling in the Pacific Northwest. One of the most secretive was known only through fragments of correspondence. The Order of the Thorned Root, believed to be an offshoot of British Druidic revival movements and Eastern European folk mysticism. The order reportedly held seasonal rites in forests near present-day Brookhaven. They spoke of binding light beneath the earth and honoring the unbroken eye, a symbol nearly identical to the one found carved into the bones of fellowship victims over a century later. Local folklore from the time recounts mysterious lights in the woods, mass animal deaths, and travelers who vanished after staying in certain homesteads. These tales never made it into history books, but the stories were told and feared. Perhaps the most disturbing chapter came in 1912, with the sudden disappearance of a spiritual commune known as the Order of the Dark Seed, founded by a charismatic mystic named Elias Thorne. The group claimed to have tapped into ancestral memory rooted in the soil of Brookhaven. Thorne, a former theological student turned occultist, believed the land was an umbilicus to forgotten gods, not metaphor, but literal. He claimed the earth beneath Brookhaven was alive, sentient, and waiting. His commune, about 40 members strong, built a compound in the woods, complete with stone altars, underground prayer chambers, and a large central circle where seed rites were held each solstice. Then, in October of that year, they were simply gone. Neighbors reported no signs of departure. Meals were left half-eaten, lamps still burned, livestock roamed freely, unfed. When local authorities investigated, they found the compound intact, but eerily silent. No signs of struggle, no bodies, just one phrase, scrawled across the main altar in black ash. Asterisk, the seed has taken root. The site was quietly buried. By the state, both literally and bureaucratically, land records were sealed. The forest reclaimed the compound within a decade. But stories of strange chanting, shadowy figures, and the reappearance of Thorne's symbol persisted by the time Brookhaven was officially incorporated as a town. The land had already absorbed generations of secret rites and whispered belief. What stood on the surface, the shops, the schools, the churches, was built atop something far older, something not fully understood, a place where belief festered, where forgotten gods found worshippers, and where history, again and again, chose not to vanish, but to hide in the wake of the mass graves discovery in 2022. Brookhaven's long-silenced fears burst to the surface with violent urgency. The town's quiet facade shattered, and theories flooded in, each more unsettling than the last. Local police, cornered by mounting media pressure and a town demanding answers, were quick to blame it all on drug cults. In a press release that now reads more like deflection than truth, Chief Deputy Harold Stokes stated that the remains likely belonged to victims of illicit drug-related activity from the 1970s and 1980s, dismissing any suggestion of ritual or organized violence. But even among law enforcement, the narrative was unraveling. The facts didn't align. Forensics teams brought in from Salem and Eugene revealed details far beyond the scope of any random criminal activity. The bones had been burned, but not chaotically. There were signs of careful placement, controlled temperatures, and a pattern of post-mortem charring that suggested deliberate purification. "We're not talking about someone trying to hide a body," said one anonymous technician. "We're talking about someone preparing it for something." Worse still, multiple bodies showed no identifiable cause of death. No trauma, no signs of poisoning, nothing. For some, death had come like a whisper, untraceable. It was as if they had simply stopped. This absence of evidence struck a nerve with investigators and gave new life to darker theories. That the Fellowship, if that's what it was, had developed methods of killing that bypassed conventional understanding. Or worse, that death wasn't the point at all. Independent researchers and conspiracy theorists seized the moment. Online forums, long obsessed with the Moonroot cult and Brookhaven's haunted past, exploded with theories. One of the most chilling accused a group of local elites, descendants of early settlers who still owned vast forested estates on the outskirts of town, of orchestrating the killings as part of generational occult rituals. A handful of these families had never appeared in the press, never granted interviews, and rarely attended public functions. One such manor, a looming stone estate known only as Holomere House, was long rumored to host private gatherings on solstice nights. Theories claimed that, behind its ivy-choked walls, guests in dark robes took part in ancient rites, echoing practices of the vanished order of the Dark Seed. Journalists, trying to dig deeper into these families, encountered dead ends. Records, sealed court documents, even non-disclosure agreements signed by former staffers. One local reporter, Amy Lister, went missing just 2 weeks after she published an exposé attempting to connect several names from Judith Ward's leaked testimony to the ownership deeds of nearby estates. Her last known location was a hiking trail near Hollow Pines Grove. Her body was never recovered. Her notes were, criminologist Dr. Irene Calder was one of the few experts willing to speak on record, a specialist in ritualistic crime and fringe religious violence. She had consulted on cult investigations across the globe. When she reviewed the Brookhaven case files, she was disturbed not just by what she saw, but by what was missing. "This is organized," she told investigators. "Not random violence, not desperation. This is structure, doctrine. There's a consistency to the symbology, the placement, the time spans. It's not chaos, it's belief." Calder pointed out that the majority of bodies were discovered in layered rings, oriented toward a single compass point due northwest. She believed it marked a central origin, perhaps a physical location or shrine deep within the forest that had yet to be found. And then there was the phrase. It appeared in 3 separate interviews, spontaneously, unprompted, spoken by witnesses whose testimonies stretched across 5 decades. In 1978, patient 62, still institutionalized, scrawled it repeatedly across his padded wall before being sedated. "We were promised the night eternal." Judith Ward wrote it in her confession letter as a quote repeated at every fellowship gathering. And in 2003, an anonymous forest ranger submitted a confidential report after hearing a group chanting it from a distant ridge during a patrol. Asterisk, we were promised the night eternal. Asterisk, to many, it sounded like prophecy. To others, a kind of spiritual Black Malan assurance to its followers that they were part of something vast, apocalyptic, and irreversible. The phrase quickly became a lightning rod in public discourse, appearing in graffiti, podcast episodes, and even etched into park signs near the Brookhaven trailhead. It wasn't just a motto, it was a declaration, and no one knew what it meant or when, exactly, that promise was supposed to be fulfilled. Investigators tried to pull together a psychological profile of the group's structure. From what little was known, the Eldritch Fellowship didn't operate like conventional cults. There was no single charismatic leader. Instead, it appeared decentralized, governed by symbols and rites rather than personality. Records recovered from the 1982 animal mutilation site included pages of handwritten text, half in English, half in an unknown cipher. Linguists speculated that it was a syncretic blend of Proto-Celtic sigils, alchemical glyphs, and fabricated characters. Dr. Calder described as a deliberately constructed language for secrecy and invocation. It mirrored practices seen in apocalyptic movements groups that believe the world will end, not in fire or flood, but in transformation. And Brookhaven, it seemed, had been there. SEEDBED. As theories multiplied, so did the tension. Town council. Meetings turned hostile. Old families were threatened. Someone firebombed a ranger station. The official narrative that this was an old crime scene, tragic but explainable, had completely collapsed. In its place stood a vast and fractured mythology that seemed to widen the more anyone investigated. Some still believed the fellowship had disbanded, its members dead or long gone, but others were certain it had simply changed shape, gone deeper underground, waiting for the right time. The bones had been burned, but the symbols endured, and the night they were promised hadn't come, not yet as public interest. In the Brookhaven mass graves surged, so too did the chaos surrounding the truth. The town, once cloaked in fog and indifference, now found itself at the heart of a media storm, one amplified by fear, fueled by misinformation and manipulated by forces that seemed intent on keeping the truth just out of reach. Every answer gave birth to more questions. Every fact seemed to come with a contradiction. And in the middle of it all, the truth was slowly being disassembled, reframed, and some say erased. One of the loudest voices stoking the fire came, not from within Brookhaven, but from the airwaves. Radio host Gideon Crane, whose late-night program, Shadowlines, had long trafficked in conspiracies and occult theory, dedicated a week-long special to the fellowship case shortly after the discovery. His broadcasts, laced with static and paranoia, painted a picture of a town under siege by its own buried past. The fellowship lives underground, he said, his voice calm and clinical, not metaphorically, literally. They built a system of tunnels in the 1950s, ritual chambers, escape routes, places to hide from the world while they planned what comes next. Crane cited unnamed sources, ex-military, former parishioners, buried whistleblowers, and by the end of the week, the phrase had become viral shorthand in conspiracy circles. The fellowship lives underground. It echoed across message boards, podcasts, and YouTube documentaries. For some, it was gospel. For others, it was gasoline. Brookhaven's mayor, Leslie Hart, attempted to calm the storm in a public press conference, standing in front of a sea of microphones. She denounced the theories as internet hysteria and grief-fed sensationalism. "What we're dealing with," she said, "is a tragic crime, one that spans decades. Yes, but it is not a supernatural cult. It is not a secret society pulling strings from beneath our streets. It's a real human tragedy, and we need real answers, not folklore." But Hart's reassurances rang hollow. Within days, protesters surrounded the town hall. Some carried signs marked with the eye of the thorned root. Others wore black hoods and stood silently, facing the building like sentinels. The line between believer and agitator had begun to blur. Then came the fire locale historian Arnold Keyes. Long considered the town's unofficial archivist, lost his home in a blaze that gutted his entire collection of Brookhaven records. He had spent over 40 years collecting newspaper clippings, handwritten letters, church logs, and family diaries, documents that hinted at the long shadow of the fellowship in the town's history. He was planning a digital archive to preserve his findings when the fire broke out. The official cause: faulty wiring. But friends and neighbors described seeing a black SUV idling outside his home just hours before the blaze. And when Keyes attempted to reconstruct parts of his collection using backups stored at the town library, he found those records gone too, missing or suddenly lost during renovations. Simultaneously, discrepancies began appearing in witness testimonies. Documents shared with journalists and researchers showed clear signs of redactions, sometimes entire pages blacked out. Other times, single words swapped. One key witness, a former park ranger named Michael Leonard, gave an interview in 2005 describing a clearing filled with burned effigies and ritual tools. But the official transcript filed by the sheriff's office referred only to illegal camping activity and scorched logs from unpermitted bonfires. Another witness, a woman who claimed to have escaped from a fellowship compound in 1989, originally described underground chambers, group silence rituals, and forced starvation. But her affidavit, as released to the public in 2023, had every reference to location removed. The only phrase left untouched: *, we were promised the night eternal. *, side by side, document comparisons revealed a disturbing pattern. It wasn't just sloppy bureaucracy, it was surgical, precise. The redactions were not meant to obscure violence. They were meant to erase belief, to surgically remove the very idea of the fellowship from the official narrative while leaving just enough ambiguity to stoke doubt. One investigator, who later left the case, said plainly, "We weren't following a trail. We were chasing shadows someone else had drawn for us." In town, paranoia spread like mold. Neighbors accused neighbors of hiding evidence. Anonymous flyers appeared, listing names of known collaborators. Social media campaigns weaponized half-truths, drawing lines between Brookhaven's political leaders and the old elite families tied to fellowship rumors. Online databases of missing persons were altered, overnight entries deleted or scrubbed of identifying details. In one shocking case, the name of a missing child from 1983 was found replaced with that of an unrelated adult who had never set foot in Oregon. When questioned, the database administrators blamed corruption during a migration update. But no one believed them. Even audio evidence began to vanish. A leaked police tape from 1991, in which an officer can be heard whispering, *, they knew we'd come. They left this for us. *, was uploaded to a cloud server and widely circulated before disappearing completely within 48 hours. Attempts to re-upload it were met with automated takedown notices citing copyright violations, though no copyright owner was listed. Truth intentionally fractured. Pieces no longer fitting. The story of the Fellowship, once a whisper, had become a cacophony of contradictions. Too many names, too many versions, too many gaps left just wide enough for someone to step in and tell their own version of events. And whether by design or chaos, the outcome was the same. The real story of Brookhaven's buried horror had become a hall of mirrors, every reflection distorted, every truth paired with a lie. A labyrinth designed not to conceal the truth, but to exhaust anyone trying to find it. And in that exhaustion, the Fellowship endured. For decades, the voices that might have unraveled Brookhaven's darkest secret were treated as background noise, eccentric, unreliable, or simply inconvenient. Their stories, when spoken, were met with polite nods and quietly discarded case files. But as the years passed and the bodies emerged, those same ignored voices began to echo with disturbing clarity. They were dismissed, laughed at, but now their nightmares aligned. Marie Lott had lived in Brookhaven her entire life, a quiet woman with a faded voice and a gaze that never quite met your eyes. In 1985, her younger sister, Delilah, disappeared after walking home from a church potluck. She was 13. The route she took passed just a few hundred feet from the edge of Hollow Pines Grove. Marie reported her missing that same night, frantic, certain something was wrong. But police at the time told her Delilah was probably with friends or ran away. There was no investigation, no search, just a single missing poster that yellowed on the town's bulletin board until it was quietly taken down 6 months later. Marie never stopped looking. She kept Delilah's room untouched, visited the edge of the forest every Sunday, and logged every local disappearance in a worn notebook, a practice she maintained for over 30 years. When the mass grave was unearthed in 2022, Marie was one of the first at the perimeter tape. She didn't cry. She simply asked, "How many are girls?" Later, during an unofficial interview with an independent investigator, she pulled a sealed envelope from her coat. Inside was a small scrap of fabric, black, frayed, with a faint red embroidery she had found near the tree line just days after her sister vanished. She had brought it to the sheriff's office in 1985. They never logged it. The next thread came not from Brookhaven, but from a mailbox in Portland in 1996. It was an unsigned letter, written in shaking block script, postmarked but never claimed. It was addressed to a now-defunct local newspaper known for publishing reader tips. The letter read, ***, the Fellowship Watchers. Always, they are beneath the hills. They hear when we speak. That's why we whisper. Because sound carries. They promise us the night eternal. And some of us still believe. ***, the newspaper dismissed it as a prank. The letter was never published, but it remained in their archives until a researcher rediscovered it in 2023, just months after the bodies were uncovered. The handwriting, analysis showed, bore striking similarities to records from a former Brookhaven schoolteacher who had gone missing in 1997, and then there was patient 62, institutionalized in 1978, and long dismissed as schizophrenic. The man, known only by his file number, had spent decades in silence, communicating only through symbols and drawings. Nurses described him as quiet, polite, and eerily consistent. Over the years, he had filled over 100 sketchbooks, all of which were stored in hospital archives, largely untouched. But in 2023, as media interest reignited, a forensic art analyst was granted access to his materials. What she found was chilling. Across multiple volumes, Patient 62 had drawn the same scene 28 times, each nearly identical, each rendered in obsessive, geometric precision. The image, a subterranean chamber, circular, lined with symbols that perfectly matched those found etched into the bones from the Brookhaven grave. In the center of each sketch stood a group of figures, hooded, holding hands in a ring around a stone altar. Above them, a single phrase written in the margins. Asterisk, the night root grows. Asterisk, when shown one of the sketches, Judith Ward, the former fellowship member who had testified briefly in 2022, visibly she confirmed, without prompting, that the scene resembled a real chamber used during her time in the group. She described it as the Hollow Room, a place where the body was made a seed. The investigators present noted that she had never seen any of Patient 62's work prior to that moment. The synchronicity between testimonies, long buried in sketches long ignored, was undeniable. Each had been dismissed on their own. Marie Lott, as a grieving sister who couldn't let go. The anonymous letter, as a fringe rant. Patient 62, as an institutionalized madman. But taken together, they formed something else, a triangulation of trauma. And all of it pointed to the same terrifying conclusion. The fellowship had never truly vanished. It had simply perfected its silence. Local officials refused to comment on the overlapping claims. When pressed about why these witnesses were never properly investigated, a former sheriff muttered, asterisk, we were told not to encourage hysteria. But behind that denial was the unmistakable scent of fear. Not just fear of the past, but of what might still be beneath the town, listening, because these weren't just stories anymore. They were records, and they were beginning to match when forensic teams began analyzing the remains found in Brookhaven's unmarked mass grave. They expected chaos signs of panicked violence, mass burial in haste. What they discovered instead was something far more unnerving. These weren't just murders, they were ceremonies. The dead had not been discarded. They had been arranged, intentionally, carefully, as if each victim was a piece in a larger ritual puzzle, and the grave itself, a monument. The layout alone defied coincidence. The 112 bodies, buried over what was likely decades, had been placed in geometric spirals, concentric circles, coiled inward like a shell or seed pod. Each body positioned in perfect relation to the next. Older remains formed the outer layers, gradually working inward to fresher corpses. No animal activity had disturbed the grave, and there were no signs of traditional decay in certain layers, suggesting that many of the bodies had been preserved before burial. One forensic pathologist, speaking off record, compared the grave to a human mandala, a death clock, or an offering. Even more disturbing were the carvings. Dozens of bones bore markings satched with a fine, sharp blade, likely post-mortem. They weren't random scratches, but precise engravings, repeating glyphs that formed a complete lexicon across the grave. The language is unknown, not matching any known script, ancient or modern, yet its structure was eerily consistent. Linguistic experts consulted by investigators described the markings as ritual language with grammatical integrity. Each symbol appeared to serve a function, often inscribed near specific parts of the body, the jaw, the ribs, the femur. Repeating clusters of glyphs appeared on the spines of multiple victims, like titles or invocations. and the symbols matched those found in early 20th century journals linked to the vanished commune known as the Order of the Dark Seed. Cross-reference revealed direct duplication, exact shapes, line weights, positioning between carvings on human bone and ritual diagrams recovered from the Order's ruins. "This is continuity," said Dr. Irene Calder, "not coincidence. Someone kept these rites alive for over a century." But the horrors didn't stop at symbols. One body in particular, a male in his late 30s, bore an especially grotesque detail. His eyes had been sewn open with coarse black thread. Post-mortem analysis confirmed the stitching had occurred after death, but not long after, while the tissue was still fresh. It was not a method of torture. It was theater. Forensic psychologists speculated that the open eyes were meant to serve a purpose in ritual observation, that the body had been made into a watcher, perhaps part of a ceremony in which the dead bore witness to something sacred. Other remains told equally harrowing stories. A cluster of infant bones, wrapped in preserved linens, were found near the center of the spiral. Their umbilical cords were still attached, long since dried and shriveled, but uncut. No signs of trauma were found on the infants, and yet their presence together, swaddled and buried in deliberate formations, suggested an entirely different layer of ritual significance. Midwives and religious scholars brought into the investigation pointed out that in certain fringe occult traditions, uncut umbilical cords symbolize spiritual continuity, a soul never severed from the root, kept bound to the source for future reawakening. There was no record of any missing infants during the estimated burial periods. No birth certificates, no medical records. It was as if these children had never officially existed. Autopsy reports, though heavily redacted before being released to the public, contained brief but devastating details. Multiple victims had traces of rare herbs or resinous compounds in their systems, substances known for use in ceremonial embalming and vision rites among pre-modern cults. Others bore signs of partial mummification, even preservation through smoke or soil compounds, mimicking funerary rites from disparate traditions. Norse, Druidic, Anatolian. The implication was clear. These were not the practices of a single belief system, but a convergence, a collected theology, and the fellowship, it seemed, had been pulling from many forgotten faiths to build one of their own. In one chilling instance, a female victim was found with small objects inserted into her mouth, obsidian shards, tiny wooden idols, and a silver coin etched with the same spiral pattern that appeared in the bone carvings. Her lips had been sewn shut, her wrists bound with wire, then delicately wrapped in linen. No records matched her identity. No one ever claimed her. Perhaps the most horrifying detail came during an analysis of the burial site's center. Beneath the innermost ring of bodies, archaeologists discovered a cavity, a small pit lined with melted wax and remnants of scorched parchment. Soil samples revealed heavy traces of blood. It was a sacrificial well, according to Calder, a spiritual sink where offerings were funneled. This was the root, she said. The spiral wasn't just symbolic, it was directional. They were burying their dead inwards, toward a core, toward something buried even deeper. For all its order and symmetry, the grave was also a canvas of horror. It did not simply hold the dead. It told a story, one carved into flesh and bone, arranged in sacred geometry, sealed with silence. Each detail was a thread in a tapestry, woven not for the living, but for whatever they believed waited beneath. And though the grave had been uncovered, its message remained hidden, part of a language we still cannot read, But one thing is clear. This was not a grave of victims, it was a temple. As the investigation into the Brookhaven mass grave deepened, the grotesque scene revealed not just a pattern of murder, but of belief. There was theology beneath the blood, doctrine embedded in every incision, every symbol, every carefully placed body. A map of devotion carved into human remains, speaking in a language of ritual and ruin. For the Fellowship, death wasn't an end. It was an offering, a process, a means to reach something greater, something they called the Eye. At the center of their cryptic pantheon stood a single symbol, the crooked thorn, a jagged, root-like spiral curling inward into the shape of an open eye, unsettling in its asymmetry, and found carved into the bones of at least 86 of the 112 victims. Sometimes it was etched onto femurs or ribs. In rarer cases, it was burned into the skull or pressed into soft tissue with ink, ash, or dried blood. The mark was always placed deliberately, a final signature, and wherever it appeared, it carried the same orientation, the same tilt, as though the victims were facing something unseen. Researchers believe the crooked thorn was more than just an emblem. It was a theological cipher, a symbol of spiritual submission, a wound offered to something vast, and watching an eye that had to be unshackled, not with prayers, but with geometry, with ritual. The geometry extended into the Fellowship's structure. Notes recovered from Judith Ward, the group's most prominent whistleblower, described a governing body called the Circle of Nine. These were not titles, but positions, filled during ritual ascendancy. Ward recalled hooded figures who never revealed their names, only their roles. Asterisk the root, the mouth, the hand, the fang, asterisk, and so on. She claimed the nine were responsible for choosing the bodies used in the spiral, determining when each ritual would occur, and safeguarding a hidden calendar, one not based on traditional solar or lunar cycles, but on eclipses, particularly those that aligned with solstices. These rare celestial convergences were seen as openings, moments when the veil between worlds thinned, moments when the eye could see and respond. That calendar, reconstructed from multiple sources, showed a chilling consistency. Ritual events were marked precisely to match eclipse solstice overlaps, dating back as far as 1954, each one correlating with either a major disappearance or a sudden fire-related death somewhere in Brookhaven County. There were 9 such dates, 9 offerings, 9 convergences, and always the same pattern: silence before, vanishing during, and absolute denial afterward. Investigators also recovered several ritual diagrams drawn in blood, charcoal, or preserved ink, featuring concentric spirals with human figures arrayed at cardinal points, always leading inward. These diagrams were often accompanied by phrases, written in both fragmented English and the Fellowship's unknown glyphic language. One phrase in particular appeared repeatedly: asterisk, we must complete the spiral to unshackle the eye. It was scrawled across the cover of a torn journal found in a rotted cabin deep within Hollow Pines Grove, a cabin containing ritual knives, broken animal skulls, and decaying photographs showing individuals in masks standing in a circle of fire. That phrase, cryptic and terrifying, became a focal point for investigators and cult researchers alike. What was the eye, and what did it mean to unshackle it? Some theorized it represented a divine intelligence, a being or consciousness worshipped not as a savior, but as a force that watches from beneath, waiting to be awakened by sacrifice. Others interpreted it metaphorically, the eye as forbidden knowledge, the spiral as initiation, death as a transformation. Dr. Irene Calder, speaking at a closed symposium, stated, "What we're looking at is not a cult that worshipped gods. They worshipped systems, mechanisms, cycles, blood and silence, orbiting a single truth, that the world we know is a locked room, and death is the only key." The most disturbing suggestion came from the forensic team who first analyzed the burial patterns. They proposed that the spiral was not just symbolic, it was functional, a physical mechanism, one that had to be completed with precise bodies, at precise times, facing precise directions. The mass grave, then, wasn't a dumping ground, it was an engine. A temple constructed slowly over decades, each death another cog in a ritual machine, designed to do something, activate something. The fellowship's scripture, such as it exists, was never spoken. Judith Ward insisted that during most rituals, no words were uttered at all, just movement. Chanting, when it occurred, was rhythmic but meaningless to her. They didn't read from books, she said. They used the dead like ink, a cult that worships silence and blood. Their scripture etched in decay, and still the final message remains unclear. The spiral was never completed. The eye remains shackled, or so it seems, but the calendar has future dates, and in the woods, around Brookhaven, the symbols still appear, scratched into tree bark, drawn in ash, burned into stone. Waiting, understanding what happened in Brookhaven demands more than forensic evidence or archival digging. It requires descent into the human psyche, into the fragility of belief, identity, and the overwhelming need to belong. For at the core of the fellowship's horror lies not just ritual, but psychological captivity, a prison of the mind, meticulously constructed, brutally maintained, and almost impossible to escape from. Cults do not begin with blood. They begin with need, with pain, and with promises. Dr. Harriet Klein has spent over 2 decades working as a cult deprogrammer. She's seen survivors from all over the world, victims of fringe religious groups, isolationist communes, doomsday sects. But when she reviewed the Brookhaven case, her reaction was immediate and visceral. "This isn't just a cult," she said during our interview, her voice barely audible in the dim-lit room. "This is something worse, something calculated. They weren't just trying to control behavior. They were remaking identity, from the inside out." According to Dr. Klein, the fellowship operated like many high-control groups, isolating its members, stripping away their sense of self, and replacing it with a higher narrative. But where most cults centralize around a charismatic leader or apocalyptic prophecy, the fellowship replaced personality with pattern. They removed identity, she explained, and replaced it with purpose, not just in life, but in death. Survivor testimony, particularly that of Judith Ward, supports this. Ward described how new initiates were subject to prolonged silence, restricted speech, and strict behavioral codes that dissolved their sense of individuality. They were referred to not by name, but by number, gesture, or symbolic designation. The mouth, the root, the fang, these roles rotated. There was no consistency, no hierarchy that a member could use to orient themselves. Everyone floated, Ward said in her testimony. That was the point. You were unmoored from time, from self, from memory. Dr. Klein refers to this technique as symbolic displacement, the deliberate breaking of a person's connection to their own story. You can take someone who is hurting, who is isolated, and offer them an escape from their pain through something larger than themselves. But in return, you take their name, their past, their will. That's how these systems survive. Not through control, but transformation. When we asked if she believed the fellowship was a case of orchestrated psychosis or mass delusion, her answer was chilling. Both. You need structure for the psychosis to take root, but you also need enough people to reflect it back to you. That's what makes it feel real, and if it feels real, it is real, especially to the person living inside it. In many ways, the Brookhaven case presents a perfect storm for such psychological programming. The town's geographic isolation, its deeply private culture, its history of buried secrets, all made it fertile ground for the slow infection of belief. Local customs, religious conservatism, and economic stagnation created a kind of collective vulnerability, a subtle desperation that cults are experts at detecting. And the fellowship didn't recruit loudly, it didn't proselytize, it whispered, it moved in shadows, offering sanctuary not from society, but from the self. One of the most alarming aspects of the Brookhaven case is the complete lack of survivor pushback. No large-scale exoduses, no public denunciations, no memoirs. Those who left either vanished, recanted, or were institutionalized. That tells us something, said Klein. It tells us the belief didn't break. It calcified, or it still has a hold. She explained that most cults implode under scrutiny. The spell breaks when the leader falters, or when ideology collapses under contradiction. But in this case, there was no face to confront, no sermon to dismantle, just ritual, just repetition, and that's far harder to destroy. When a belief is tied to a person, it can die with them. But when it's tied to a symbol, to a calendar, to geometry that can outlive generations. We asked Klein about the recurring phrase, reported by multiple witnesses, we were promised the night eternal. She took a long pause before responding. It's a cognitive anchor, a liturgical phrase. What it does is bind a person's hope to an abstract promise. It offers reward in mystery, and when that reward isn't clearly defined, it can never be disproven. It lingers, like a virus in the mind. She compared it to phrases used in high-control religious sects and militant orders, phrases designed to override doubt and instill submission. In the case of the fellowship, it also served as a warning that life outside the belief system was incomplete, that to reject the fellowship was to remain unawakened. It's spiritual blackmail, she said, a psychological dead end. To illustrate how deeply such conditioning can penetrate, Dr. Klein shared a deprogramming case from another cult survivor unrelated to Brookhaven. The woman had escaped her group after nearly 2 decades, but for years afterward still woke at dawn and recited verses in a language she didn't understand. She didn't know what the words meant, Klein said, but they were in her. They were hers. That's how deep this can go. In Brookhaven, the victim's bones tell a similar story. Ritual patterns, carved sigils, post-mortem alterations performed not for concealment, but for continuity. The fellowship wasn't just worshipping something, they were building something. Over decades, with bodhis and belief, even now, with the site unearthed and examined, the psychological infection lingers. The town is fractured. Fear has returned. Some residents claim to dream in symbols. Others swear they've seen gatherings at the edge of hollow pines. Grove and the phrase, "We were promised the night eternal," still appears. Chalked on sidewalks, whispered in schoolyards, etched into bathroom stalls. A chant without a singer. A memory without an owner. Belief can be weaponized. In Brookhaven, it was perfected. Piece by piece, the ritual and the horror it concealed was mapped out. The Brookhaven case wasn't a sudden eruption of evil, but a slow, deliberate accumulation. A design so gradual, so patient, that most didn't see it until it was too late. When the investigation pulled back the curtain in 2022, what emerged was a timeline not of scattered tragedies, but of a methodical ritual built across generations. A spiral, not just in burial, but in time itself, circling always toward a center no one was meant to see. It begins in 1962. The disappearance of 8-year-old Henry Delk was the first to raise quiet alarm. He vanished walking home from Sunday school, last seen near a logging road on the southern edge of Hollow Pines Grove. No body was found. No trace. Local police filed it as a likely abduction or animal attack. A tragedy, but not unprecedented. What few realized was that Henry's disappearance marked the first verifiable date on what would become the Fellowship's ritual calendar. It coincided with a solar eclipse, falling just days after the summer solstice. It was the first point. On the spiral in 1971, 9 years later, construction crews began expanding a hiking trail system through Brookhaven's Forest Preserve. Midway through excavation near the northern ridge, they encountered a sudden cave-in, the earth beneath them collapsing into a hollow chamber. No bodies were found, but workers reported strange remains, broken stone altars, charred bones of small animals, and symbols burned into the rock walls. A worker, in a now-lost interview, described the smell as old blood and candle wax. The construction was halted indefinitely. The trail was never completed. Official records of the event are minimal. What's chilling is that the excavation occurred just 3 days before the winter solstice, again aligned with the Fellowship's supposed sacred calendar. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, disappearances accelerated. Each year brought more missing persons, most with no ties to one another, no overlapping patterns, beyond proximity to Brookhaven's forests and an uncanny silence from law enforcement. By 1985, posters lined the windows of every local diner and church board. Marie Lott's sister Delilah vanished that year. A 17-year-old drifter named Paul Wexler the next. In total, 32 people would disappear between 1975 and 1986. Almost all during solstice months. Almost all without a trace. Then came the letter in 1989. An unsigned letter was recovered from the belongings of a deceased town librarian. The letter referred cryptically to an Elder Zahir, allegedly the last surviving leader of the original Circle of Nine. The writer warned that the final steps of the inner spiral were close. It was the first time the circle was mentioned. In any document, a term later confirmed by Judith Ward. The letter also referenced something called the Bloodroot Cradle, suggesting an inner sanctum where the youngest victims were offered. Though never proven, some believe this directly links to the uncut umbilical cords found in the infant remains decades later. Throughout the 1990s, the Fellowship's presence receded into rumor until the 1991 discovery of the dismembered arm in the forest, wrapped in cloth embroidered with the crooked thorn. It was a turning point. The first hard evidence that something more than legend was at work. The case briefly drew federal attention. The FBI opened a file, conducted interviews, and then, inexplicably, closed it. No findings were released. Records were sealed. The arm was quietly transferred to a private forensics lab and never returned to Brookhaven law enforcement. Many believe it was the closest the outside world ever came to cracking open the ritual's timeline. In 2003, the name Zahir surfaced. Again, this time in a private note left behind by a forest ranger who went missing while patrolling near the old cave-in site. His final report mentioned chanting under the ridge and symbols moving in the fog. His body was never recovered. The case remains unsolved. For nearly 2 decades, there was silence. No new evidence, no open investigations. The spiral appeared dormant, and then, in 2022, the earth opened. Construction on a new trail, not far from the halted 1971 project, unearthed the edge of a mass grave. At first, it seemed accidental. A few bones, a hiker's remains, perhaps, but within weeks, the count surpassed 100. Bones burned, marked, arranged. The fellowship, once whispered, dismissed, denied, was now carved in bone and stone, impossible to ignore. The bodies told their own story, not just of death, but of time. Layers of the grave corresponded almost perfectly with the dates, theorized in Ward's confession and the fellowship's obscure calendar. Each spiral ring was a generation, each body a clock hand. They hadn't buried randomly. They had counted down. Timeline analysis conducted by cult researchers and forensic analysts uncovered a 9-phase pattern, spanning exactly 60 years. From 1962 to 2022, each decade bore 3 known sacrifices, each phase closer to what the fellowship referred to as the unshackling. If that pattern holds, the next phase would begin in 2031. That's what haunts those who still watch Brookhaven closely. That perhaps, despite exposure, despite the unearthing of bones and symbols and truth, the spiral remains incomplete, and someone, somewhere, is still turning the wheel. When investigators created a red string reconstruction of the timeline, connecting dates, locations, names, and symbols, what emerged wasn't just a sequence of crimes. It was a ritual design, an intentional choreography of suffering. Victims weren't chosen at random. They were offered on dates that matched eclipses, on solstices, at the perimeter of ritual sites. The ritual wasn't just spiritual, it was mathematical. The final entry on the timeline, for now, is marked in blood-red ink. Asterisk, July 12, 2022. Asterisk, the day they found the grave, the day the spiral was interrupted. Or, perhaps, completed. The grave is open now. The bones catalogued. The reports filed. But the air in Brookhaven still tastes like ash. The discovery in 2022 should have offered closure, or at least a place to begin healing. Instead, it tore the town open, all over again. For many, the aftermath of uncovering the fellowship's long-buried horrors has not been justice, or peace, or even answers. It has been silence, heavy, deafening silence. Because what do you do when evil leaves no face behind? In the months following the unearthing of the 112 bodies, efforts were made to identify and return remains to surviving family members, but many families, too many, refused. Some out of fear, others from grief too deep to resurface. A few denied outright that the bones belonged to their loved ones. One woman, whose sister had vanished in 1983, simply said, asterisk, that's not her. That's what they made of her. I can't take that home. In total, fewer than 40 sets of remains have been formally claimed. The rest remain in county custody, held in cold storage, labeled with numbers instead of names. Another echo of the Fellowship's cruel dehumanization for those who did come forward. Closure has been complicated. Adam Renshaw, whose brother Thomas disappeared in 1995, stood at the site of the makeshift memorial months after burying what little had been recovered. His voice cracked during our interview. "They took more than a life," he said, staring at the candlelit vigil still flickering in the dusk. "They took peace. They took our memories and twisted them into something else, something that doesn't sleep." The town of Brookhaven, in an effort to publicly reckon with the past, erected a memorial near the edge of Hollow Pines Grove, a simple stone circle with 112 names, some real, some listed as unknown. For a brief moment, it offered the community a place to mourn, to gather, to begin speaking aloud about what had been hidden for so long. But within 2 weeks, it was vandalized. Red paint streaked across the names, symbols scrawled in crooked spirals, and one message painted in thick strokes across the central pillar: "We are not Dan." Police called it an act of teenage vandalism, but those who have studied the Fellowship's iconography knew better. The spiral was not random. The handwriting mimicked earlier recovered samples, and the message, simple, haunting, echoed the group's central theology that the ritual was not over, that the eye had not yet opened, that the spiral, though interrupted, still had its center waiting. Even more troubling is what didn't happen. No arrests, no charges, no confirmed living members of the Fellowship brought to justice, though several names were floated, elders mentioned in testimonies, potential participants in ritual events. All evidence was either circumstantial or mysteriously incomplete. Files went missing, witnesses retracted, surveillance failed, and in the official press release given by the Oregon Bureau of Investigation in late 2023, the case was declared *ongoing with no prosecutable suspects at this time. Off the record, a senior investigator admitted, "every time we think we have a name, the trail goes cold, or we get pulled off. This thing's bigger than anyone wants to admit." Among the townspeople, a quiet unease has taken hold. Not open panic, but something more corrosive: doubt. Doubt in law enforcement, doubt in the official story, and most dangerously, doubt in whether the Fellowship was ever truly dismantled. Strange sightings continue in the woods. Candles found, burning at night. Spirals carved into back doors, scratched into park benches, etched into mailboxes. Small things, but they add up. Even those trying to move on find themselves haunted by something deeper, something harder to name. At the local high school, a guidance counselor reported multiple students describing dreams they don't remember having, waking with dirt under their fingernails. A nurse at Brookhaven General Hospital resigned after discovering a drawing in a child's journal, a perfectly rendered crooked thorn, drawn with black crayon, the words "I see it now" scribbled underneath. The child, when asked, couldn't recall drawing it. The spiral may have been buried, but something in Brookhaven remains unbroken. In homes across the county, families sit at kitchen tables with empty chairs. Old photographs have been moved into drawers. Closets are still locked. And in many houses, there are rooms no one goes into anymore. Not out of fear, but out of something worse. Understanding that the story doesn't end just because a grave is found. That some evils don't wear faces, they wear patterns. They wear calendars, they wear silence. In the end, the question isn't why the Fellowship did what they did. It isn't even how. The question that lingers, the one that keeps returning, circling like the spiral itself, is this. Asterisk, how many more are still out there, waiting for the next date on the calendar? Asterisk, the bodies have names now. Some of them, others don't. The files are closed now. Most of them, others aren't. But the woods are still there, and Brookhaven still doesn't sleep, even now. After years of investigation, hundreds of interviews, and thousands of pages of forensic reports, the true nature of the Eldritch Fellowship remains maddeningly unclear. The spiral was exposed, but never fully unraveled. And the deeper investigators dig, the more it feels like Brookhaven's horrors were never meant to be understood in isolation. Like they were only one chapter in a longer hidden gospel, one that stretches beyond the woods, beyond the grave, and deep into places no one has dared to name. The official record ends with 112 bodies found in 2022, but the questions didn't end there. In fact, that discovery opened a dam, and in the years since, a flood of theories, whispers, and buried histories have begun to surface. Some are wild, paranoid, even conspiratorial. Others are meticulously documented, disturbingly plausible. What they all share, however, is a single terrifying implication. Asterisk, we didn't end the fellowship. We simply interrupted it. Asterisk, one of the most persistent theories is that the fellowship was never just a fringe cult hiding in the woods, but a branch of a much larger, older, and far more protected network. Rumors of connections to elite social circles in Portland have circulated for decades, long before the grave was unearthed. Wealthy donors linked to vanished charities, art collectors obsessed with ritual symbolism, estate owners who held solstice gatherings with guest lists that have since disappeared. A leaked 1984 ledger, recovered from the burned archives of a defunct Brookhaven chapel, listed a series of patron gifts sent from Portland to unnamed recipients in the county. The items included antique blades, rare herbs, and preserved vessels. No context, no receipts. The chapel burned in 1986. Arson ruled as the cause. No charges filed. Dr. Harriet Klein, the cult deprogrammer who has studied the fellowship for years, believes this connection is more than myth. Cults that survive for decades, that grow in secrecy, that leave bodies behind, they don't do that without protection. Financial, political, legal. Someone made space for them to thrive. She cites reports from whistleblowers who tried to speak out in the 90s, only to be discredited, fired, or institutionalized. These people weren't delusional, she says. They were silenced. Silenced. That word comes up often in Brookhaven's history. Not just in testimonies, but in files marked redacted, in transcripts that cut off mid-sentence, in audio recordings mysteriously lost. One investigator told us that his report on the 1991 armed discovery was edited without his consent. Before being submitted, they changed my language, he said. They softened it. They made it sound like an accident, not a message. Even former law enforcement officials have begun to speak, carefully and off the record. One retired Brookhaven detective, who asked not to be named, recalled an incident in 2007, a set of bones found by a hunter near the old railway line, wrapped in black cloth. We were told to log it as animal remains, he said, but I know a human femur when I see one. When pressed about who gave that order, he simply said, asterisk, higher than me. Asterisk, and then there's the matter of the caves. The original 1971 construction that unearthed symbols and scorched stone beneath Brookhaven Ridge was quietly covered up. The land was declared unstable, sealed off, and removed from county hiking maps. But several geologists, in recent years, have noted anomalies in the soil structure around Hollow Pines Grove, evidence of deep artificial excavation, tunnels reinforced with ancient wood and stonework. In one unreleased drone survey, LiDAR imagery revealed what appeared to be a secondary spiral formation, larger, deeper, and untouched. That footage, we're told, has never been made public. This has led many to believe that what was discovered in 2022 wasn't the only site, just the first. A warning layer, a surface sacrifice. And if that's true, then the most terrifying question of all becomes relevant. Asterisk, how many more are there? Judith Ward, the former member-turned-whistleblower, once said, "You only saw what they wanted. Buried, the rest is still waiting." Her cryptic reference to the chambers beneath the chambers is now being re-examined in light of this theory. Could there be other graves, other spirals, deeper underground? Constructed, not over. 60 years, but centuries. And then there's the calendar. Every scholar, investigator, and cult researcher involved in the fellowship case has confirmed the pattern. 9 cycles, 9 phases, spanning from 1962 to 2022, but nowhere in no file, no journal, no diagram, does it say that 2022 was the final phase. Only that it marked a convergence. That word appears multiple times in the fellowship's recovered writings. Not closure, convergence, a meeting point, a joining of what came before, and what is yet to come. If that is true, then we are not at the end. We are at the midpoint, and the spiral isn't finished. It's merely paused. Dr. Irene Calder, one of the few forensic psychologists allowed access to the original remains, offered a chilling conclusion during our final interview. "We've been looking at this as a murder case, a cult, a historical tragedy. But that's not what it is. It's a system, a machine, one that wasn't built to stop after 112. That number is arbitrary, symbolic, a ritual layer. If there are more sites than I believe there are, then we're only looking at the surface of something much older, much deeper, and far from over. Indeed, many believe the fellowship simply moved underground, literally and figuratively, that they adapted, dispersed, or infiltrated. After all, no arrests were ever made. No bodies recovered from the circle of 9, no paper trail proving dissolution. Only evidence of continued sightings, continued symbols, continued silence. In 2024, a missing persons report was filed from a town just 30 miles north of Brookhaven. A teenage boy vanished during a blood moon. Days later, a spiral was found burned into a clearing. The boy has not been found, and still the phrase persists. We were promised the night eternal. It appears in graffiti, in whispered interviews, in the margins of recovered notebooks, in the dreams of those who never knew the fellowship but feel its weight nonetheless. What remains now is not certainty, but dread. Because if the fellowship was only a chapter, if Brookhaven was only a doorway, if the spiral was only the beginning, then what lies at its center? And if 112 were found, asterisk, how many weren't? Asterisk, the horrors uncovered in Brookhaven may have shocked the nation, but to those who've studied ritualistic cult behavior and archaeological anomalies for decades, it wasn't an isolated nightmare. It was a flare, one that illuminated a global pattern long hidden in the dark. Across continents, over decades, scattered beneath remote forests, abandoned cities, and forgotten institutions. There have been whispers of something older, deeper, and eerily similar. Different lands, same symbols. A pattern that stretches beyond any one town's history and far beyond the borders of the United States. In 1993, deep in the Mato Grosso region of Brazil, local villagers began reporting strange disappearances. Children vanishing on their way to school, some never even making it out their front doors. Over the course of 8 months, 43 children disappeared from nearby towns. Authorities dismissed the events as related to drug trafficking or runaway cases, until a hunter stumbled upon a partial burial site near an abandoned rubber plantation. What he found stopped investigators cold. Remains of at least 17 children buried in a shallow spiral formation. The bones bore markings, shallow carvings that local forensic teams couldn't decipher, though several bore resemblance to ancient Amazonian symbology. But one mark stood out, a twisted spiral etched into the femur of the smallest skeleton, almost identical to Brookhaven's crooked thorn. The case was buried under political scandal and jurisdictional chaos. No charges, no follow-up, just a warning, asterisk, let the forest have its secrets, asterisk, travel across the Atlantic, and another echo emerges. In the summer of 1976, near the outskirts of the Black Forest in Germany, hikers discovered a stone circle hidden beneath moss and overgrowth, its centerpiece. A sunken pit, lined with bone fragments and scorched soil. Authorities unearthed an elaborate ritual chamber, complete with carved altars, dried bloodstains, and a series of stone tablets depicting hooded figures circling a central spiral. On the largest slab, archaeologists identified a crude emblem, a thorned vine curling round an eye, a crooked thorn, or something very close. At first, it was dismissed as remnants of a medieval sect, possibly tied to regional paganism. But modern dating techniques place the site's use much more recently, possibly active into the early 1970s. The entire chamber was sealed by order of the government within a month. Public access denied. The official reason: asterisk preservation, asterisk an. In Japan, 2001, another rupture. In the rural outskirts of Akita Prefecture, engineers renovating an aging elementary school unearthed a subterranean room beneath the main gymnasium. The chamber was not on any architectural plans. Inside, investigators found a circle of ritual: candles, disintegrated robes, and bones, mostly animal, but at least one confirmed human tibia, placed in deliberate order. The walls were covered in soot and painted symbols. One investigator, speaking anonymously years later, described the centerpiece as asterisk, a spiral of eyes, dozens, maybe hundreds, all watching the center. The school had been closed in 1988 due to administrative restructuring. Locals later revealed that had a history of ghost stories, whispered disappearances, and an unusual curriculum that included silent meditation drills for children as young as 6. No charges were ever filed. The chamber was cemented shut. These cases, Brazil, Germany, Japan, span language, culture, and theology, and yet they share a symbolic spine: spirals, eye motifs, sacrificial geometry, and in several, some variation of the crooked thorn, always a spiral twisted around a central wound. Dr. Irene Calder, after examining records from all 3 cases, was blunt. Asterisk, this isn't coincidence. This is doctrine. Fragmented, yes, adapted to place and time, but rooted in the same mythos. Asterisk, researchers now suspect that what we call the Eldritch Fellowship may be less of a single cult and more of a shared ideology, a belief system passed through generations, like a virus, mutating, adapting, and hiding within the superstitions of local cultures. Each iteration takes on the face of the land it infects. In Brookhaven, it was the Fellowship. In Brazil, Deus Filhos da Sombra. In Germany, simply Die Spiral. In Japan, no name was ever given, only the whispered phrase, Mi, ga haraku toki, asterisk when the eye opens. Asterisk one chilling detail spans all these cases. In each, investigators noted that the site appeared recently vacated, as if whoever had been there had left just before discovery. And in several cases, warnings were found, phrases painted, carved, or scrawled in blood. Asterisk, we are not done. Asterisk, the spiral begins again. Asterisk, you are too early. Asterisk, so, what does this mean? It means Brookhaven is not the center, it's a point on a map, a flare in a constellation. And if there are patterns across continents, matching dates, matching symbols, matching deaths, then this isn't a closed case. It's a living one still unfolding, still burying bodies beneath new soil. A map overlay produced by independent researchers shows a disturbing convergence when plotted against solstice-aligned eclipses over the past 100 years. Many of these ritual sites align near the center lines of astronomical events. It's as if someone or something is tracking the sky, waiting for specific moments to act, to offer. Dr. Calder offers a grim possibility. Asterisk, what if this is not just belief? What if it's a clock, and we're only beginning to understand what it's counting down to? Asterisk, different lands, same symbols, same silence. The spiral isn't confined to Brookhaven. It's etched in the dirt of forgotten forests, the bones of stolen children, the stones of rituals long buried but never forgotten, and somewhere it's still turning. The woods are quiet now. Wind rustles gently through the trees above Brookhaven, bending pine limbs that once hid so much more than just birdsong. The trail near Hollow Pines Grove is overgrown again, no longer patrolled, no longer spoken of. Just a scar on the map, a hush in the landscape. And yet, something lingers, something deeper than memory, colder than bone. A silence that breathes, a shadow that waits. We still don't know their names. Not all of them, not the ones buried in pieces, in spirals, in fire-scorched cloth. We don't know their voices, the laughter they once had, the songs they once sang. We don't know what they believed or what they were promised. Only that they gathered, again and again, under moonlight and blackened skies, drawn by symbols and whispers, bound by something none of them would ever speak aloud. And maybe that's the point. This isn't about ghosts. It never was. It's about what people become when no one watches. What communities look like when silence is worshipped more than truth. What faith becomes when it's stripped of light, twisted into geometry and blood and obedience. The Eldritch Fellowship wasn't just a cult, it was a design. A pattern built in shadows, passed from hand to hand like a sacred poison. One that didn't just demand death, but devotion. It lived not in temples, but in basements. Not in books, but in carvings. Not in sermons, but in ritual. And it thrived not because people believed in evil, but because they needed to believe in something, anything, in Brookhaven. They found that something in each other and followed it into the woods, into the earth, into the spiral. Even now, long after the last shovel lifted, the last bone from the dirt, the questions remain. Where did they go? Why did no one stop them? How many more sights lie beneath our feet, waiting to be found? Or worse, never meant to be. No arrests, number, confessions, just fragments, scars, burned pages, eyes sewn open, spirals in the dust. And the phrase, always the phrase, we were promised the night eternal. Maybe the fellowship is gone. Maybe it truly did die in the dark with its last ritual. But if you listen closely, when the wind cuts just right across Brookhaven's fields, there's a feeling that clings to your skin like the breath of something just behind you, watching, waiting, not gone, just quiet, because that's the final horror, isn't it? Not that evil exists, but that it can vanish without a trace, that it can dress itself in symbols and kindness and community, that it can pray and chant and promise salvation, that it can sit across the dinner table, that it can wear your neighbor's face, and that when it leaves nothing behind but silence. The memorial at the edge of the forest still stands, though many won't go near it. Some say they hear whispers when they pass. Others say the flowers never last more than a day. But the stone remains cold, cracked, defaced, a monument not to justice, but to absence. A reminder of what was never answered. In the end, the fellowship did what all great darknesses do. It consumed, it disguised, and then it disappeared. But its spiral remains in symbols, drawn in chalk, in eyes that wake at 3 a.m. for no reason, in children's drawings, in dreams. The soil may have been disturbed, the bones pulled from their hiding place, but the pattern, the design, is still there, quiet, waiting, as it always has, and maybe, as it always will, fade to black, static, one final whisper, curling through the dark like smoke. Asterisk, we are the eye, and we have seen you.